like the results of doing things in a libertarian way, has the advantage that we can offer both evidence. We don't have perfect controlled experiments, obviously, but we do have some rather striking cases where you have two very similar societies, one of which is much closer to socialism and one of which is much closer to libertarianism than the other. So that gives us some evidence. The obvious cases are East Germany and West Germany, South Korea and North Korea, China and Taiwan, Taiwan and Singapore, China under Mao and China at present. All of those are cases where you shifted from a much less libertarian to much more libertarian, although still less libertarian than we would like, system, and the result was a very, very striking difference in how well off people are. There are not very many people in South Korea who would choose to live in North Korea, and not many people in Taiwan when Mao was in power who would choose to live in China. So that's pretty good evidence, empirical evidence. And then there are logical arguments, and that's a good deal of economics and can be put in various forms, but essentially you can show reasons to believe that rent controls cause problems, that minimum wage laws cause problems, that we can expect governments to function badly, and so forth. So the one problem with the argument I'm now making is that in order to make the consequentialist argument, you have to know what good consequences are. All right, I'm saying that the free society will lead to better consequences, but how do I show what consequences are? And the answer is that I don't have to. And the reason I don't have to is that the people you want to convince already have beliefs about what consequences are better. And although they vary some, they do not vary, I think, enough to make my claim false for any of the plausible ones. That there are very few people in the world who are actually in favor of poverty, starvation, or disease. And by those criteria, we have good reason to believe that very unfree societies are worse than very free societies, and we can at least argue that freer still societies would be better still. So my claim is that if we can show that libertarianism produces much better results than the alternatives, most people will support it. And it does. One way of putting it is think about an argument with a socialist in which he concedes all of your consequentialist beliefs. Right? You have certain beliefs about the results of socialism or of libertarianism. If he agreed with you about what the results of those two would be, do you think he would still be for socialism? I think the answer is that very few socialists do. If you actually look at the arguments, in fact, I would even go further. I would argue that the socialist and the libertarian have moral views that are closer to the same than we usually acknowledge. That the sort of Marxist view about exploitation is that workers produce everything and only get some of it. But that assumes that production is the proper basis for ownership. All right? It's not allowing for the fact that capital also contributes to production. But the underlying moral intuition is still the same as ours, that people who produce things ought to own them. So the argument I'm offering would not work if people had very different values with each other. If there were really a substantial number of people who thought poverty was good. And it would also work if liberty was only a little bit better than the alternative. Right? If it was only a little bit better than the fact that different people put different weightings on different things. That there are people who say, well, I'm against poverty, but I'm also against inequality. And if the result of liberty is that people are a little bit less poor, but much less equal, he might still be against it. But I don't think that's the case. I think if you actually look at the actual results of, say, communism, to take an extreme case, it was pretty clear that the difference between a well-off person in that society and a poor person in that society was very much greater than in our society. I was struck by this actually traveling in India 2 years ago, because India at that point had been run for almost all the time since independence by socialists, explicitly. People called themselves socialists. And India looked to me very much like the picture of America that a 1950s communist would have if he'd never been outside of Russia. That is a striking contrast between rich and poor. That I spoke at what was essentially a business school in a city in central India. And the business school was a lovely campus. It was forested and not many buildings, but also lots of free space. And it was surrounded by a high stone wall with barbed wire on it. And then surrounded by India. So that struck me as evidence that we don't have to prove whatever we believe about economic equality not being important. In my view, it isn't very important, except the consequences. Because you aren't going to get it except at very high levels of poverty, which nobody believes in. So that's the basic approach I'm arguing. Let me sketch the economic argument for believing that the consequences are better. And we start with what economists call the coordination problem. And the problem is that in order to do anything in a complicated society, you have to somehow coordinate the efforts of a very large number of people, perhaps a million people. And the standard example of this is a pencil. And to make a pencil, you need wood. To get wood, you need chainsaws. To get chainsaws, you need steel and gasoline and copper and probably rubber and a bunch of other things. And each of those things has a chain going back, and somehow you've got to arrange things so that enough chainsaws are made to cut down the number of trees that you want to cut down for the number of pencils you're making, as well as lots of other things trees are used for. Enough steel is produced to make that number of chainsaws plus all the other things you're making and so forth. So if you really try to imagine sort of a set of equations, it's an enormously complicated system. And it should be obvious to you that we're all dead. That we can't possibly do that. Because after all, our food system, our food production system also depends on very large coordination. We have tractors and fertilizers, and all sorts of other things, and trucks to carry the. It doesn't do any good if the corn stays in the field. It's got to get to me. So there are basically two solutions to the coordination. And the obvious solution is centralized control. The obvious solution is to have somebody at the top who tells everybody else what to do. And for very small versions of the coordination problem, that works. Think of a single firm owned by one owner with 6 employees. He can indeed be equivalent. He can say, well, you've got to do this, and you've got to do this, and so forth and so on, in order that we can produce our restaurant food or whatever. The problem with the simple solution, the centralized solution, is that it doesn't scale. That as the system being coordinated gets larger and larger, the problem of coordinating it gets more complicated. The person at the top is farther from the person at the bottom who's actually doing things. And that means both that he is less likely to know what the person at the bottom is doing and to be able to make him do it. It also means he's less likely to have common interests with the person at the bottom and therefore want to produce the outcome that the person on the bottom wants. So the centralized approach is not entirely unworkable. That after all, corporations are in some sense examples of that. But it doesn't scale very well. The alternative is the decentralized solution. And the decentralized solution basically consists of breaking the problem into pieces, giving each piece, the decisions with regard to each piece of the decision, how much coal this person will mine, to a person who has the relevant knowledge and controls the relevant assets. I can feel my hands. And somehow arrange things. This is the impossible sounding part. Somehow arrange things so that each of the actors bears the cost of his acts summed over everybody affected, receives the benefit of his acts summed over everybody affected, at which point now what is in my interest is in our interest. Right? Think about the ideal centralized system. It is somehow set up so when I decide whether or not to dig some more coal, the reward for that represents the total value to everybody who will use the coal. The cost for that represents, in the simplest case, my time and effort, but it could be somebody else's tools or something that I have to use. And therefore, the net gain is positive if the net gain for everybody else is summed over everybody is positive, negative if not. If it's positive, I'll do it because it's in my interest. If it's negative, I won't. That's the simple argument for how you make a decentralized system work, and the only problem is it sounds impossible. Right? And it does sound impossible, but it turns out one of the things you learn in economics is that a market system of trade comes surprisingly close to it. It doesn't do it perfectly. We can discuss that a little bit. But what it does is to transmit both costs and benefits to individual actors through the price system. So if I need certain inputs to produce, in order to get those inputs, I have to pay somebody else enough so we'll give them to me. That means I've either got to pay the cost of producing it, or pay the cost of whatever else would be done with it. I've got to bid against other potential users of those inputs. So that means that the price I have to pay is, at least approximately, equal to the cost of producing them or the value of the person who's giving them. Right? When I produce something, I sell it. Well, when I sell it, that transmits to me through the price I get by selling it, the value to the person who's getting it. The full explanation of how this works requires about a year of price theory. But if you don't feel like taking any more courses, I've got a book called Hidden Order, which you can read for free online from my webpage, or you can buy from Amazon, which is an attempt to do the equivalent of about a year of price theory for the fun of it. And the history of that book is that I wrote a price theory textbook, and I gave a copy of the price theory textbook to my favorite aunt, who I'm sure never read it. And she gave the copy to her son, who I'm sure never read it. And he gave the copy to his daughter, who I'm sure never read it. And she gave the copy to her fiancé, who's a doctor. And I was told that he entertained the family at breakfast with reading my price theory textbook. And that persuaded me that I ought to try to rewrite the textbook, not as a textbook for classes, but as a book people would read for fun. And my model, insofar as there was one, was the book The Selfish Gene, which does the equivalent of that for genetics, for evolutionary biology, essentially. The Selfish Gene is a book that I read for the fun of it. I had no particular need to. And it, in fact, is by a very accomplished evolutionary biologist. And it's fun to read, and it teaches stuff. So that was my model. Anyway, that's a digression, but let me keep going. Let me now talk about the reasons it doesn't work perfectly, which are what economists refer to as market failure. And as I have said in other talks, market failure is a misleading term because it's a real problem, but it's not limited to markets. It's a problem that exists in lots and lots of different contexts. I think I gave an example in my talk yesterday of market failure on the battlefield, where an army runs away because every individual in the army is better off running away, even though the whole army is better off if they stay. So the basic problem with market failure is that there are situations where the individual does not pay the full cost of his action, or does not get the full benefit, where the conditions are not met. One such is what economists call negative externalities. If one of the costs of my making steel is that people downwind from that end up coughing because of the unpleasant sulfur dioxide given off in the process, that's the cost to them but not to me, so I will make the steel even if total costs are larger than benefits. That's one problem. And the other side of that is a situation where you can't collect the value of what you do, and the standard version of that is what's called a public good problem. Public good for an economist does not mean a good the government produces. There are lots of public goods that are produced privately. I think I'm privately producing public good. It's very interesting. And there are lots of things governments produce that are private goods. Public good is a good such that you cannot control who gets it. And therefore, you cannot use the standard mechanism of saying you have to pay me the price in order to get it. And I'm saying this talk is a public good, not to you people, because I could I suppose, if you'll let me exclude some of you, but because I'm giving the talk in the hope of increasing the amount of knowledge of the arguments for liberty in the world, in the hope that will make the world a freer place, and I cannot exclude somebody who's not here from getting the benefits of the world becoming a freer place. So that is a public good. But in any case, the public good problem is that a good may be worth more to the people who consume it than it costs to produce, but since